Good evening. Welcome to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills on Monday, February 3rd, 2025. On this show, we strive to present clear thinking on confusing topics in challenging times. We have a very special guest this evening, the prolific author and founder of the Liminal News Podcast on YouTube and elsewhere, and the Liminal Institute, a leading-edge psychedelic, spiritual, and political thinker, Daniel Pinchbeck. But first, I'm going to take a brief detour to honor Tyree Ritchie, a young local Black activist and former KSQD host with me on the collective program that I first joined when I came to K-Squid called Unheard Voices. It was with a tremendous amount of shock that I learned that Tyree had self-immolated on the Black Lives Matter mural on Inauguration Day, which also happened to be Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I was privy to some discussion about whether or not to name Tyree and to make it public that it was Tyree, but pretty soon the word was getting out. And after the word was getting out and a vigil was planned for Tyree, who is still alive, by the way, and we've heard that he has awoken. This vigil, or once the vigil was planned, I decided that I just really wanted to honor Tyree's work, because Tyree's work, even though he was very gentle and soft-spoken and even a little shy when I was with him in meetings, he was out there in the streets leading huge protests on Juneteenth and for Black Lives Matter and leading forums for community safety to bring us closer to social and racial justice. And for those of you who were able to get to the vigil last night, it was such a relief to have a chance to make flower bundles for Tyree. There were hundreds of people there, and it just felt so fitting to be walking at night through the streets, saying his name, walking the same streets that I have walked behind Tyree on many times before, and then to lay our flowers on the Black Lives Matter mural in a big, big circle with people speaking, close friends speaking, and then going to take all of our flowers to, there's sort of like an altar at City Hall now, which will be up for a week. So if you want to go visit that altar for Tyree Ritchie, you can. And I have to say that I think people just really need to be in community, as we just heard from Suki Westling's amazing reporting from the Martin Luther King Jr. Day Parade, which happened just before this event with Tyree. I think so many people came because, even maybe people who didn't know Tyree came because we just wanted to be together and say, you know, clearly this administration is racist in the most virulent, hateful way, and we, at the very least, are going to show up and protest against that. So anyway, I just had to say those few words for Tyree Ritchie, who is in my thoughts every day, pretty much. And now on to Daniel Pinchbeck. Daniel Pinchbeck is the author of Breaking Open the Head, a Psychedelic Journey into the Heart of Contemporary Shamanism, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, How Soon Is Now, When Plants Dream, and Notes from the Edge. Pinchbeck is also founder and host of the Liminal News Podcast and the Liminal Institute. And you can find these on Substack and also on YouTube. He has been writing and podcasting about the MAGA movement, current events, philosophy, spirituality, and various mythologies, and recently interviewed MAGA acolyte Laura Loomer on his podcast. Pinchbeck is co-founder of the web magazine Reality Sandwich and of the website evolver.net, and edited the North Atlantic Books publishing imprint Evolver Editions. He was featured in the 2010 documentary 2012 Time for Change. He is the founder of the think tank Center for Planetary Culture, which produced the Regenerative Society Wiki. Daniel Pinchbeck, welcome to our show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Oh, good. We can hear you loud and clear. That's always a blessing. When I was researching you online and even just reading your bio right now, it's a lot that you've done. It's a lot of topics that you're covering.
Yeah, I mean, some of those things are frankly a little bit out of date, but
sure.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing right now is the newsletter, which is danielpinchbeck.substack.com. and the course platform, Liminal News, and also a think tank I'm working on with people around the world, actually, which is the Elevator.Earth.
Okay, the Elevator.Earth. Okay, gotcha. And I mean, some listeners may be tuning in just to hear you because they know you and they're fans. You know, I'm sure we have a lot of people actually in the Santa Cruz County area and Central Coast area who are like that about you. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work in your own words. And I know that some of that is that you have a history of being an academic, a kind of a cynical person, or an intellectual, I should say. And then you took iboga. Is that right?
You sort of right. I don't know if I guess I was a New York native. My parents were artists. My mother was a writer. My mother had been involved with the Beat Generation in the 50s and wrote books about her experiences as a young woman. She was involved with Jack Kerouac for a few years. So I grew up in that milieu, but I was I was a secular materialist, skeptic, dropped out of college, worked in magazines, had a kind of spiritual crisis or existential crisis of nihilism, remembered my psychedelic experiences from college and decided to try to understand what that was because they were really fascinating and nothing else seemed to indicate that there might be other kind of like realms of consciousness in a way. So that led me to, iboga. I went to West Africa. I went through the Bwiti initiation, taking iboga, which is a long-lasting visionary plant substance. I also went to the Amazon in Ecuador to work with ayahuasca. I visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico and in Oaxaca, where we discovered the psilocybin mushrooms in the 50s. And on, different substances, LSD, DMT, different research chemicals. I interviewed Sasha Shulgin. That was part of the book. He was this sort of research chemist who discovered hundreds of psychedelics. And he kind of rediscovered MDMA in the 60s. And just from there, went on. And then I wrote a second book and a third book. So, whatever you want to talk about.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot we could cover, but I have definitely some specific questions for you. I just want to read a passage that you wrote on Substack recently, and I just found it kind of moving and also kind of darkly humorous at the same time. And it's been your tone, I think, for a while now. For the last few days, I keep trying to write about some ideas I find very beautiful, but it is difficult for me to complete any thought as my attention keeps swiveling back to the rapidly unfolding destruction of the United States, where I unfortunately live. I don't know why. Any kind of humor that I can pick up these days, I'm going to take. You know what I'm saying? And and so it sort of expresses to me what I've seen as sort of your very thoughtful approach to what's happening, and then also this sort of stretching into spirituality and mystical thinkers and poets and writers who can help us perhaps know how to process what's happening at this time. And I want to back up and say I met you, I first discovered you actually because I had heard from some local friends that were into RFK Jr., and who were also into Eisenstein. They were sort of saying, hey, even Eisenstein is supporting RFK Jr., and Eisenstein is even maybe a little okay with Donald Trump. And I thought, what? Because I had also followed Eisenstein and had really enjoyed his books and his thinking. And then I went to Eisenstein's Substack, and I saw these sort of, I would call them apologetic articles in the broad sense about Donald Trump and MAGA. And I got really upset, actually, because some of what he was saying was, Trump isn't the problem. We're the problem. We're just projecting onto Trump, and that's making him this or that. And I was at that point, I was like, I'm out, Charles. I'm out. And I saw that you had done some writing about Eisenstein, and I'm wondering if you would talk about. Did you have a relationship with Eisenstein before this happened?
Oh yeah, I mean, basically when we were doing Reality Sandwich around 2009. I somehow discovered Charles's work. He wasn't very well known, and I was really excited about him and started promoting it a lot on the site. He did a whole tour of our kind of communities. Then I edited and published a book that he wrote, Sacred Economics.
Wow. So you're very involved with Eisenstein, who is kind of a New Age thinker, by the way, for folks who don't. New Age ecology type thinker and writer for folks who don't know.
I mean, I've had a very interesting trajectory with Charles, but also with Russell Brand, who I was formerly close with.
Wow.
Or associated with. But with Charles, I mean, I began to find myself less and less resonating with his work a number of years ago. I really didn't really like his climate change book. I didn't like what he had to say about COVID. A lot of people, like the COVID thing was really twisted something inside of people in a way, like led them to make kind of bizarre jumps in logic and so on. And then he got all on board with RFK, which a lot of the sort of new bourgeois spiritual culture somehow thought RFK was a good thing. And I was open to RFK, but I actually interviewed him, and I was very surprised by his defensiveness, and also very surprised that not only was he, against the COVID vaccines, which are a complicated issue, but also he didn't feel that polio or measles vaccines or smallpox were actually good. He felt that the benefit from these things were actually more had to do with better hygiene or something. And, I guess I'm enough of a believer in establishment science to think that that's bunk, that these were actually very important life-saving tools and so I think that ultimately then I read RFK's book and I found it full of misinformation and kind of exaggerations and and I watched some of the hearing, but I would say I consider RFK to be a crank and a dangerous crank who has a sort of addict, narcissist, megalomania personality, as so many of the people surrounding Trump do. And I really hope he doesn't get confirmed for that position, because I think a lot of people will die if he's running our health services.
Oh, it's horrifying. I mean, I was looking at the New York Times, my online subscription. I just hit, how you can sort of see all the headlines at once. And I was reading the headlines and I felt like I was reading The Onion. I was just like, oh my gosh, this is insane what's happening in our country. Here's another passage that you wrote. The neo-spiritual progressive movement, which now that would include Eisenstein, that might include Russell Brand, has splintered apart, with many becoming Maha adherents, which would be Make America Healthy Again, which is what RFK Jr., that's sort of his motto. Even as DJT, American Savior, kills the inspection agencies and deregulates corporations who will further degrade the quality of our food, water, and air with the toxic forever chemicals spreading cancers. That's what you wrote. And in fact, we've just heard that the Trump administration has stopped the EPA from its moving forward, trying to ban these forever chemicals. These I think they come from plastics, right? And so, and so I guess what I was trying to figure out, like, why Eisenstein, why Brand? What do you think happened there? I know that Eisenstein, because I did a lot of reading on Eisenstein because I wrote my own piece on Eisenstein for our Substack also, but that he really did start to also become very contrarian during COVID. And a lot of people that I know did, and so I keep wondering, what is that impulse? Did they get scared, and they suddenly felt like this is too much and sometimes I think, well, white men in our society generally don't have to deal with hardly any restrictions,
totally.
on their traveling, or heaven forbid you should limit anything that I want to do. But what has your analysis been of this neo-spiritual progressive movement?
No, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, kind of Americans for the last, since the Second World War, really have been promised kind of know that they can sort of have lived lives without, kind of service or without responsibility. And, what's that led to is like a whole generation of very entitled, people that now we're seeing with the lack of pushback to, this sort of a coup that's underway. Kind of like there's no courage, like the muscle of courage has not been developed in the American population at this point. So, we get sort of craven capitulation, whether it's from the corporations or the government, from the Democrats or something. So, I mean, everybody has their own individual journey, and you can, it depends how molecular you want to get or whatever. But I mean, I think for Charles, he was going through kind of a midlife crisis. He was feeling that his ideas weren't really he had an audience, but they weren't really influencing society. And, he also, he was like a product of the Ivy Leagues also. Like there's a certain mentality that comes of ambition that comes with that. And so he saw the sort of RFK train as a, way to be relevant. Obviously he was getting paid very well, like $20,000 a month or something.
Right.
And, it just, him kind of losing his sense of purpose and meaning and looking for something to get sort of carried along into. And also kind of him just losing his moral focus, I think. Like that's what I felt with even with the climate change book. But we don't have to analyze him in too great depth. With Russell, I think Russell was always quite tricky. Like, somebody called him like in a way like a hippie catcher. Like what he kind of did is he went into the left and the spiritual left, and he got all these followers. And then he made this, this sort of right-wing swerve, and he probably took a bunch of them with him, as RFK has done also. So, I guess people who are into, these more kind of like unprovable and subtle areas like astrology and energy healing and raw milk and all this stuff, they are kind of susceptible to demagogues or to false information. So, what I've definitely seen over the last, 5-6 years is, people that I really cared about and liked getting like pulled into this whole MAGA thing. And we also know that it's a very, complicated and expensive psyop where, whether it's like Russia or the Heritage Foundation, like a lot of money has been spent, Cambridge Analytica, to create the filter bubble effect, to use social media algorithms, to feed people more of what interests them, that makes them see the world in a certain way, until finally they've like detached and disengaged from evidence-based reality. And it's like now we're just sort of in a nightmare, really.
Yeah, I know. We're talking with prolific author Daniel Pinchbeck, who also is now on Substack with Liminal News, with his own column on Substack, just called Daniel Pinchbeck. Is that right?
Yeah, it's danielpinchbeck.substack.com.
Yeah, and then also a podcast called, I think, Liminal. Is it the Liminal Podcast? Liminal News Podcast.
Liminal News Podcast, yeah.
Right, okay. And so, I've been tracking all of this for a long time. You mentioned the psyops, and I was reading that the Russians were actually, sort of trying to figure out how to dismantle us, for a couple decades now. And back even in like 2012 or 2014, they were starting to amplify the sort of anti-vax rhetoric on social media at that time. And you had talked about that. I was on a group call with you where you went pretty far back, actually, to the Koch brothers. And I wonder if you could trace that for us, just because I think it's important for people to understand what's happening so that we can respond and maybe help to educate others.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a very useful book is this book, Dark Money by Jane Mayer. And it starts in the 60s where you had these sort of right-wing kind of oil billionaires, the Koch brothers, the Mercers and so on, who didn't like the direction of American society, where, because basically starting in the 40s, we had the taxes on the highest paid people over $200,000 income, 91% of that was taxed. And so that high tax rate of the wealthy is what actually created the Great Society. It's what allowed us to have all this money for public services and education. And, that ultimately led to what was called the Great Society and, kind of a more equitable society and so on. And, that also led to these social movements. You had a large middle class, a lot of kids who had time to, leisure to kind of think about things and then experiment with, psychedelics or, different ideas or whatever. So that kind of led to these movements of the 60s, like the civil rights movement and the green movement and the women's liberation movement and the sexual revolution and the psychedelic movement and so on. And these guys hated all of that. And they realized that, they had to come up with a long-term plan to change the direction of American society, but they also had billions of dollars. So they were able to, field test. They would try different things and see what happened and then try again. So they created think tanks like the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute. They found intellectuals who represented their values, somebody like Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve, who, basically by focusing on minority populations, maybe don't do as well as certain standardized tests, and then saying that proves that these minority populations are less intelligent intrinsically, genetically, and that means that they don't need to have as much social services. It's kind of a waste to put social money towards them, and so on. They also bought academic departments like University of Chicago, and they filled it with people like Milton Friedman and sort of this sort of libertarian, neoconservative kind of approach. The Reagan movement was obviously, one success story of this group. They saw that they needed what looked like grassroots movements, like the Green movement. So they created, what we call astroturf movements, like top down, that imitated grassroots movements like the Tea Party and so on. And so they just kept experimenting until they figured out how to really, then with social technology and social media, that actually made it much easier to manipulate people, through these profit-driven companies that are really only make greater profits by maximizing outrage, maximizing attention. So it was like a whole bunch of confluence of things, and then obviously, various things happened, like the Citizens United decision, which allowed corporations and wealthy people to really influence elections. You had the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was a catastrophe, both because it allowed for media consolidation, so Fox News could take over markets and so on. And then it also, I think it's Section 230, where they made it so that tech platforms like Facebook and Twitter were not legislated as kind of news properties or media properties. So they weren't responsible if people were making false statements or deceptive statements. So those are like some of what turns out to have been kind of like the nails in the coffin of our situation. They just led the whole thing to take off in this direction. Then the other thing I think is really important to recognize right now is the sort of right-wing tech elite. I would say if you had to choose one mastermind of this current situation, it's actually Peter Thiel, who was the first big red tech person in 2016. You might remember he gave a speech at the Republican convention, very impassioned about he was like a gay tech entrepreneur and yet a Republican and so on. And he really seems to have a very far-right libertarian ideology and even a kind of religious thing. Like he talks about Antichrist as actually being like liberal humanism, and that Antichrist is actually these efforts to try to help suffering populations and so on. So J.D. Vance is really a protege of Thiel, is a kind of construct of Thiel, and J.D. Vance was kind of perfectly positioned between the Christian evangelicals, the Christian fanatics, of which there are tens of millions, and Opus Dei and so on, and the tech community. Yeah. So they kind of picked him as like the perfect person. Now, my guess is at this point, it's more like Vance and maybe a little bit Thiel and certainly Musk running the government rather than Donald Trump. Partially because I just learned about Donald Trump's diet. There's a cute Instagram feed where they look at the diets of different politicians. I mean, Trump has been drinking gallons of Diet Coke a day for a very long time. Plus, he regularly eats fast food, Big Macs, Doritos, Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, his mental functioning is obviously at a fairly low level at this point, because that stuff is just going to put holes in your brain over time. So, yeah, if you want to look at who's probably running the show right now, I mean, Trump was basically like, always willing to sell himself out to the highest bidder. Yeah. And 2016, he didn't really have the right group behind him to really do a despotic takeover of the U.S. But unfortunately, this tech elite, who are very megalomaniacal, have really had, kind of like almost too much power, too much wealth, and so on, have come to believe their own kind of press in a way. They believe that the same ideology that was used in Silicon Valley, which was like move fast, break things, create monopolies, don't just innovate and destroy the old systems and replace them. They believe that exact same ideology they can use on the government. Then you also have people like Thiel and Elon Musk and David Sachs, who are all white South Africans who actually approved of apartheid. And those people have now joined forces with people like the Kochs and the Mercers and the Christian evangelicals. So really what they're planning at this point is a very extreme kind of takeover of America. I mean, quite likely one of the ideas is to crash the economy, or they're certainly open to that happening, as that would allow, as it did in the Depression, the super wealthy can then buy up the distressed assets at a fraction of the value.
Oh my gosh.
And it'll just increase the centralization of wealth and control, and most people will just be pauperized.
Yeah, I've just been reading about that before. They
also want to repeal the Civil Rights Act. I know you're just talking about Martin Luther King. And even, Peter Thiel has said that he doesn't think that women should have the right to vote. So they really want to wind it all the way back. And we know I read Kevin Roberts' book from the Heritage Foundation. He, for instance, he wants to get rid of not only abortion nationwide in all circumstances, but even contraception and even IVF. So they don't want women to have the opportunity to wait around until they're a bit older to have children. They want to sort of force everybody to have kids when they're young, particularly white people, I guess, and create this sort of this white nationalist society.
And have you been looking into this movement called the Natalists, which I think I don't know about Peter Thiel, but I believe that J.D. Vance and Musk and a whole bunch of sort of far-right Christian people are part of. And I'm confused because I'm like, so they want, I guess, white babies, lots of white babies. But if they restrict abortion for everyone in this country, that's going to be everyone of all colors. In fact, wealthier people will be able to get abortions and not people who are of lower incomes. And historically, that has been people of color and new immigrants and so forth. And yet they also don't want more people of color. So so what is going to happen to the people of color is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of confusion, in certain respects. But I mean, that's a good question. I mean, unfortunately, I interviewed this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's said to be the philosopher of this movement.
Yeah, I saw that.
And, on a personal level, I kind of got along with him. I met him at an event in Miami and so on, but somehow he is, the very, very extreme. I mean, he basically has written over and over again that the U.S. should be run like a technology corporation with a dictator CEO, and he's also said things like, he joked, he said it was a joke, but that like the underclass, and the minorities, poor minorities could be converted into biodiesel, for the buses. We just don't really know how extreme this is. I mean, I don't think that Musk's Nazi salute was an accident. I think that actually that's the ideology that he represents at this point.
Yeah.
And that's, it all, anyway, then the whole thing about Israel is obviously like the sort of Christian nationalist movement in the U.S. likes Israel a lot. They don't like the Jews. They would like to get rid of the Jews, I'm sure. But what they want is to have that kind of ethno-state here, where you have where the ethnic group in charge has free reign to, imprison, torment, even kill the population of the minorities and so on.
We will be right back after this short break.
KSQD thanks GPI Builders for supporting this program. GPI Builders is a locally owned and operated full-service construction company with more than 10 years of experience and expertise. GPI Builders specializes in home additions, ADUs, and residential remodels throughout the Bay Area. For more information, 1-800-916-8343 or gpibuilders.com. Thank you, GPI Builders, for supporting community radio, K-Squid.
Tonight, we are talking with Daniel Pinchbeck, who is the author of many books on psychedelics, the psychedelic movement, mental health treatment through psychedelics, the return of Quetzalcoatl, how soon is now, when plants dream. And Pinchbeck has been doing a lot of work on Substack and also at the Liminal News Podcast and the Liminal News Institute. And we've been talking about sort of like how people on the left started to move to the right. It's something we've covered quite a bit on this program. And also the tech bros, really, a lot of them are here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We're down on the Central Coast, but Silicon Valley is right over the mountains or just north of us. And Elon Musk is in San Francisco, and our radio show team and our Moment of Truth collective have been doing a lot of research into what these folks are up to in San Francisco. And some of what they've been doing, Daniel, has been to sort of come in as like centrists in the city and start taking over this is a very progressive city. San Francisco start taking over the politics. And some of the things they're proposing, I'm not sure if you've looked into this, are like, I call it like little apartheid cities where tech companies or tech people can buy land and have their own cities and kind of keep everyone else out. The most extreme people are saying, you can't get in without a key card, and we'll have a security force guarding this place.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the sort of a network state concept. And yeah, they're setting them up in other countries like El Salvador. There's one called Prospera. And yeah, it's a really, I find it, very offensive. But I don't know how, when I try to look ahead at what's going to happen, it's so abstract and so ideological. It feels like eventually it's going to kind of break apart on the hard shores of reality. But maybe many years, and a lot of devastation before that happens.
Yeah. You wrote this on your Substack. So many millions of people are ideologically captured, deeply indoctrinated, and hypnotized. However, our social, technological, and ecological conditions change rapidly. They will continue to mutate. For the sake of our children and other young people, at least, we must maintain the belief that this juggernaut of greed, hatred, and false piety will also burn itself out and self-destruct at some point. Amen to that. Let's hope, right? I wanted to talk, I don't know if you know much about these folks, and then I do want to get into like what you're seeing now and how, maybe your mystical experiences and research and writing are playing into how you are responding and possibly encouraging others to respond. But you also did a podcast about Ukraine and why it's important to support Ukraine. This is another area where I've been sort of shocked by what the left, where some of the people on the left have gone. Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, Chris Hedges, the whole website called Gray Zone. Have you looked into that at all and maybe why people have gone? Some of them have been paid by RT, we've been discovering, right? So, or they have been for a while actually writing for RT, but we've had social influencers recently sort of persecuted by the DOJ under Biden for being on the RT payroll, which is the Russian payroll, more or less.
Yeah, it's another very sad situation. I don't know what else to say except Greenwald and Taibbi. A lot of people, maybe they started out with justifiable anger against the Democrats. The Democrats have been terrible. The Democrats are also supported by the billionaire class and have shown that they don't have the strength of character or independence, except for a few outliers, like Alexander Ocasio, to sort of really go against the thing that's happening now. So yeah, we're unfortunately the direction we're heading is very, very Putin-esque or very Orban-esque. I don't think people recognized or they were voting for what they're going to get, which is, Hungary is like the poorest country in Europe now. And, Putin's Russia, most people are very poor. The few people have a lot of money, but everyone has terror of the, the dictators and so on. It's really a horrible way to live. And, unfortunately, the fact is that the Democrats were really kind of disastrous. It's funny. I'm talking about all this stuff. I'm not even particularly a political person. I'm not for the Democrats. I'm much more of a sort of kind of a social ecologist, kind of like a Murray Bookchin style, kind of like anarchist in a way. And yeah, as you said, I'm more interested in indigenous cultures and, this whole thing, this whole empire psychology and mentality, this whole kind of megalomania, kind of psychopathic, elite that we have now, just feels like something that, either it's going to kill the whole planet and everybody on it, which is to be quite possible, or it's like a fire that has to just like burn through everything. And then whoever's left after will hopefully, have more sense and will create something better.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're starting to see pushback. There have been huge protests in L.A. and Boston, and I'm trying to think of the St. Louis, I believe, and Georgia. And we saw in Black Lives Matter how big these protests could be and how long they could last. I think that younger people, the younger generations, with support from a lot of people in the older generations, are very racially aware. They're very much, I believe, for social justice, and a lot of it just has to do with these are their friends. A lot of their friends are people who are second generation immigrants whose parents came here undocumented, and they know what kind of fear people are living and their friends are living in right now.
Totally.
And
I think that if there is going to be some kind of effective movement in that sense, it really needs to start quite quickly, because if you also look at the the $500 billion that Trump just pledged to the Stargate project, that's Larry Ellison, who's a mentor of Musk's and a friend of Trump's, big supporter of Trump, and he was the CEO of Oracle. And Ellison has said repeatedly that what he wants to do is to build an airtight AI digital surveillance system that will keep everybody on their best behavior. So and Musk similarly with X has talked about having like a kind of universal payment system that everybody has to be on, that's mandatory. So what we're really talking about is like WeChat in China for the U.S. And it's just extraordinary to me that the MAGA people who are so much about individual sovereignty and responsibility have voted for something that's they've been swindled into voting for something that's far more authoritarian than what they thought they were getting with and I understand the concerns, which I also shared around Biden, the sort of kind of neoliberal kind of technocrats, the World Economic Forum. Part of the problem is that the powerful technologies we have right now, which are so our technologies are so much more powerful than we've reached the level of ethical development to deal with them. Kind of trend naturally in this direction. Like years ago, we thought they trended in making the world open and connected. And certainly you could, imagine a world where the internet would be designed in the public trust and would create like a participatory sharing infrastructure where local, political decisions could be made in a more participatory and unmediated way from the local to the bioregional to the planetary framework, and where you had things like mutual aid and, ways to share resources and templates for building community and healing, ecological damage. It certainly would be possible to use the internet for that. Unfortunately, what we have now is become very parasitic. And unfortunately, since the early days, since the rise, it's also, if you think about like Facebook and all these companies, Twitter and so on. The internet was actually created by taxpayer money, Microsoft and so on, and they basically just gave it away to the plutocrats, without getting anything back. Like there's no public oversight, there's no, there's a good book, Internet for the People, is an excellent book that just looked at how ridiculous this is and how actually, the internet was created by us, by taxpayer money. It shouldn't have been allowed to be just taken over by profit-seeking companies. Yeah. And so I could see potentially a mass collective movement to retake the internet, stop the sort of tech overlord takeover and so on. I just don't know. As of now, it doesn't feel like the collective will in the U.S. is strong enough. But maybe as things get darker, that will show itself. I don't know.
I have a slightly different take, which is, I think that people have been waiting for the person to call the march and waiting for the person to call the strike. I think people are getting ready. I think we were exhausted after the election. A lot of people worked hard on that election, whether they agree totally with the Democrats or not. A lot of people understood what was at stake. For me, I was like, we're buying wiggle room is what we're buying with this election, and some other things,
But that's also not really, to be honest with you, it's like, unfortunately, it's not even a very good argument, because we've always been buying wiggle room and it just led to this. So if this was going to happen at some point, which in a way feels like it was the trajectory, maybe it's just... Maybe it's just the natural end. Yeah. We do have. We can see what happens. Maybe there is silver linings. The government was overly bureaucratic. Like we did, there are areas where they're kind of right about certain things, but I mean, we do know on the other hand that it's much easier to destroy than to build.
Yeah.
So just to like wipe away all these institutions that have developed over centuries, if you don't, I mean, their idea is just to, privatize, sell them off to the highest bidder, shock doctrine style. But maybe we'll get lucky, and that will allow for the emergence of something completely unexpected, and new.
Well, you talked to Laura Loomer, which is interesting. I watched at least some of that interview before this one with you. We're talking to Daniel Pinchbeck, by the way, the author of many books on psychedelics and philosophy and ecology, and now we're talking about politics with Daniel Pinchbeck. And I'm with you, Daniel, that I'd much rather be doing other things. In fact, I used to only teach resiliency, and I was involved in a spiritual psychology, and I loved my work in trying to shift human consciousness. And then I started to realize, well, wait a second, if we don't pay some attention to politics, we're going to go to hell in a handbasket, and here we go. If you're out there listening and you want to ask...
I'm not even sure we've got a handbasket right now.
It'd be nice to have at least a handbasket, a little pillow. Daniel Pinchbeck is with us at KSQD. You can call in if you like at 831-900-5773, 831-900-5773, or you can email us, as always, at on-air@ksqd.org. On air, one word, at ksqd.org, and I will try to read your question or comment on the air. So, Daniel, I had so many things that I wanted to talk to you about, but I think people need a little bit of hope. I do want to mention that there are these marches planned for Wednesday, or rallies at state capitals at noon across the United States. We're seeing people come out. There are boycotts being called for at Target and all these other places that have been rolling back their DEI. And what I can't envision, Daniel, is... This is a huge country with so many people who will be impacted. I mean, if you just include women, that's 52%, right? And then if we include immigrants and people of color and the LGBTQ plus community, it's way more than 50% that are going to be impacted. And already Laura Loomer's been shocked, right? I think people are shocked that Elon Musk has gone into the Treasury Department with his hard drives and is collecting data on everybody. And so I do think there's potential. I mean, I can't imagine, like you said, how are these people with these grand ideas about ruling the world going to handle us in a way? Like, where do you see some cracks? You saw a crack with Laura Loomer, for example. Laura Loomer, who was, like, people were speculating was Trump's new girlfriend, very, very much a MAGA person.
Yeah, she's sort of, interesting. She's like a muckraker psychology. Like in the 60s, she probably would have been like a, super leftist or something. But when she grew up in a conservative Jewish background in Arizona, she worked for Project Veritas. And then she was banned from like Twitter and Facebook, and YouTube and everything. And she wrote a book called Loomered about her aggressive style. And she's very much against immigration. She's made, videos about the Great Replacement Theory. That's not, we don't have an affinity there. I don't really have a problem with immigration. But, then on Twitter, she wrote about the H-1B1 visa issue. So she started this huge thing where, suddenly a lot of the MAGA base realized that Trump's new allies in the tech world were all for bringing in foreign workers to take, what they saw as American jobs in the tech industry. And there's like tens of thousands or more of these people. And so for instance, and they're kind of like indentured servants because they get paid less. And if they don't toe the line, they get deported if they lose their jobs. So for instance, when Musk took over Twitter, he fired a lot of the normal employees, but he kept all the H-1B1 visas things. So actually a pretty big issue.
Wow, I didn't know that part. I didn't know that part. That's interesting.
Yeah, because they're the ones who just have to do whatever he says. Like if he says change the algorithm and make sure that everybody sees my comments first and so on, they just have to do that or they get deported.
Easily controlled or more controllable. Not going to defy him. Interesting. I didn't know that part. I didn't know that he fired the people who were not H1N1 visa holders.
Yeah. So so that her comments around that went viral, and his response was to immediately, and he'd been saying that he was a free speech absolutist, which is obviously not the case, but he deplatformed her. So that was her living because she trusted that the platform was safe for her. She had $27,000 a month in subscriptions and so on. So he took that away from her. He took away her blue check mark. He muted all of her virality and so on. And suddenly she realized this was just as bad as what had happened to her with Facebook and YouTube. So she started, became politically aware that this new tech oligarchy that had surrounded Trump was actually a very bad thing, as Steve Bannon has also, picked that up.
Right. And so I have this question for you. Sorry, but do you have something important to say?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead,
So, if they get rid of everybody in the working class, if they replace everyone with AI robots, if they deport everybody, and, who are they going to even sell products to? Like, I don't understand the end game. And then I have a feeling you've read and listened to Douglas Rushkoff, who, talks about meeting with, and you've probably met with some of these people, I imagine. It seems to me you kind of maybe move in some of the same circles as Douglas Rushkoff. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Rushkoff. He's a good friend of mine.
Who talks about, these people think everything's going to collapse eventually, maybe sooner than later. They're building bunkers. Zuckerberg has a huge underground bunker that he's building in Kauai, where he has hundreds and hundreds of acres. And so I don't understand what they think. They're not trying to move towards some utopia. It doesn't feel like maybe they think they're going to be the only ones living on Earth, and they'll just use robots for. I mean, it just sounds so dystopian even for them, So I don't get it. And I wonder if you see any cracks because, there's a crack with Laura Loomer, but you talk with these people at least you talk with Douglas. So what do you think about? Could they change their minds?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's why I'm trying to keep lines of communication open to people like, even Curtis Yarvin and so on. I guess, a friend of mine actually just sent me something that he wrote about you have these kind of wounded personalities. I mean, a lot, Trump and Musk are narcissists and, a little bit maniacal, but their fathers were also narcissists. They're also kind of like, narcissist extensions, of these wounded fathers. And so they always want approval, and they're turbulent, like their inner world is very turbulent. So it's kind of like they're exteriorizing that kind of turbulence and insecurity and anger and kind of like, I went to this event that Peter Thiel's Founders Fund put together called Hereticon in Miami.
Okay, and did they invite you to go?
Yeah, they did, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because they have a bunch of them have very interesting. Have interest in the apocalypse, and certain ideas of that we're actually in a kind of apocalypse. And I've written about prophecies, like my book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. Really tried to understand indigenous and even Judeo-Christian prophecies.
Oh, and you have a great hopeful quote from that book. I'm going to read it if you don't mind after you say this. Go ahead. We need hopeful quotes.
Yeah. But I just felt like a lot of them really were like there just wasn't a lot of love in the air. You know what I mean? Like people are kind of like, I think they had, parents who, weren't very caring or didn't touch them very much. And so they ended up very resentful and angry. And they sort of focus this resentment and this anger kind of out at other people, so they don't want it's really a shame that a certain type of character that then becomes a hoarding mentality around wealth and control and so on, and something about these personalities in a capitalist system that really only prioritizes wealth accumulation and ignores quality of being, quality of experience, care, empathy are not monetizable. These types of people have risen to the top of our power structures. So I think that kind of it indicates that we're reaching the end of this whole system, which might also be the end of humanity as a whole, as I said, or maybe this is the necessary prelude to a kind of burning out and then a reconstruction or recreation.
Yeah.
One thinker I actually published a a video that a seminar that he gave on my Liminal News platform. Christopher Botch, he wrote a book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And he did many, many high-dose LSD sessions and basically began to get this huge prophetic download, which somehow very much resonated with me. Like he saw into the near future, and he saw this destruction and a lot of people dying and so on. But then sort of new communities forming, and those communities creating these sort of new mycelial kind of like networks, and then sort of a new culture. Human culture kind of like emerging out of the ashes, of whatever we go through.
Yeah, I'm down for that.
He saw that happening fairly quickly, which makes sense with communications devices and so on. Like, we could easily, if something works, in a community, we can easily template it. We can bring it to other communities. We can modify it for local conditions and so on. By the way, I tried years ago to build a kind of nonprofit sort of around these kind of ideas called the Evolver Network. We had like 60 local groups, and it's still something that really interests me.
Yeah. I can see a little bit of a silver lining in terms of like people boycotting, starting to buy local, being maybe afraid to buy so much international food with the EPA, and these regulatory agencies starting to shut down and not having staff or whatever the heck is going on. People might want to be very close to home in their purchasing habits and, start to really build community. Everybody wants to build community right now. I can't tell you how many people are texting me and trying to start signal chats or whatever to create little nodules of, community at this time. And so we'll see what happens. If you want, this is your last chance to ask a question of Daniel Pinchbeck. The number is 831-900-5773, or you can shoot us an email at onair at ksqd.org. Is it okay, Daniel, if I read this passage that, sometimes I go to prophecy too, because it helps me just to have a bigger picture. And I don't know if prophecies are all true, but they soothe me, So of
course.
Okay, I'm going to read this from the Return of Quetzalcoatl, and you just quoted it in your Substack recently. This was maybe a vision you had or a dream. Maybe you were using psychedelics or not. You are right now living at the time of revelation, apocalypse, and the fulfillment of prophecy. Let there be no doubt. You stand at the edge of the abyss. What are these shadows that crowd around you? They are the unintegrated aspects of your own psyche projected into material form. The word apocalypse means uncovering, and in these last clock ticks of this world age, all must be revealed, uncovered so that all can be known. The material reality that surrounds you is beginning to crack apart, and with it all of your illusions. The global capitalist system that is currently devouring your planetary resources will soon self-destruct, leaving many of you bereft. But understand the nature of the paradox. For those who follow my words and open their hearts and minds, for those who have ears to hear, there is no problem whatsoever. What is false must die, so what is true can be born.
Yep. That was a prophetic transmission I received, which had never happened to me before. Like being a channel wasn't even something that I believed in, but it did happen as a result of some working with ayahuasca in Brazil with this religion called Santo Daime. And for about a week, I had a voice that was like speaking to me that actually at that time, explained that it was the voice of the Mesoamerican deity Quetzalcoatl. The feathered serpent, and very strange experience. I put it in my book, but then I also said, look, these things happen. Like, it happened to like Muhammad, happened to Moses. It even happened to like Joseph Smith, who started the Mormons. I don't know what truth value to ascribe to it, but clearly, I sometimes joke to myself that like, if that book had been targeted at 2025, everyone would just be like, that makes total sense. Like 2012 came and went, and there wasn't maybe, the level of transformation that people were anticipating. But now we're definitely in the throes of that.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. We are getting to the top of the hour. Is there anything else you want to say? We've been directing people to your podcast, which is Liminal News.
The main thing for me right now is I I do these online seminars, and I'm doing one upcoming on Rudolf Steiner, which is, I thought we were going to talk a little bit about Steiner, but he was
go for it.
Occult visionary. He lived I think he was like 1861 to 1925. He was originally, he was a philosopher. He developed Waldorf schools, biodynamic farming, but also he really developed this very elaborate, like esoteric cosmology that was also very prophetic. And Steiner said that he was the mission of his life on Earth was to bring the knowledge of reincarnation back to the West, and that people in the West reincarnation was a real thing. And not only did people incarnate in different epochs, different bodies, and so on, but the Earth itself reincarnated and took different forms, and that we were approaching like another kind of transformation, metamorphosis, incarnation of the Earth. And a lot of his things that he said seem very accurate right now if they're understood properly. I mean, he also talked about vaccines and said eventually a vaccine would be developed that was able to kind of cut the spirit and the body, so people would be left without their spirits and so on.
Oh, geez. People are going to run with that, just be careful.
Yeah, they did. That came up a lot in the COVID thing.
Okay.
I thought it was a little bit, it's just, I mean, it's also it's interesting trying to find the right approach to people like him, because it's not like all of it was amazing, but I would say like a lot of what he kind of put forth is really mind-blowing, and it was really a whole different approach to like thinking and reality and so on.
And you're doing seminars on him at this time.
Yeah, Liminal.news. We're doing a month-long. It'll be kind of an introduction to Steiner's work, and we'll talk about how he understood through his readings of the Akashic Record, humanity's kind of cosmic evolutionary journey. We'll look at some of his more practical ideas, his meditations, and biodynamic farming and Waldorf and so on. Yeah, it should be really cool. He's one of my favorite thinkers, and I think he's unfairly kind of neglected.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That sounds fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Then the other thing is, if people want to follow my work more, which of course I would appreciate and recommend, it's danielpinchbeck.substack.com is my newsletter.
Yep. Yeah, I've been reading that. Yeah, and I recommend it. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. We give many thanks to our team, Nyanko Nyasu, sound and tech engineer, and our research and production team, Nyanko, Mei-Ling Obinata, Joy Schendel-Decker, Vara Ramakrishnan, and Todd Zimmerman. Todd Zimmerman of Nativerse Studios created the theme song. Kathy Krizik created our logo. Find our podcast of this show and many others at all your favorite podcast sites under Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. And please like, subscribe, rate, and share our podcast. This helps us spread the word. Episode notes and links to resources are at our program page at www.ksqd.org. This is Amy Chen Mills, and I am signing off. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.